You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Welcome to the podcast Psyched About Education. This series celebrates the academic excellence of the work carried out at the Department of Psychology and Human Development and the impact this work has on policy and practice. In other words, how can psychology make a difference? I'm Dr. Amy Harrison, an Associate Professor in Psychology and Clinical Psychologist. And I'm joined here today by Chloe, who has a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa and is receiving treatment. And our other guest is Dr. Marta Francesconi, a lecturer in psychology and psychologist. In this podcast, we're going to be focusing on the relationship between decision-making and the development of eating disorder symptoms. So welcome, Chloe and Marta. Thank you so much for joining me in this podcast. I hope that we'll be able to bring together our research experience and the findings that we've been working on and personal lived experience of an eating disorder. We've been using data from the Millennium Cohort Study, and this is a longitudinal study that followed people up. A cohort of people born in 2000 to 2001 have been followed up throughout childhood and adolescence. And we've been using data from 11,303 boys and girls in that study. And we've been interested in thinking about the presence of symptoms of eating disorders, and eating disorders are quite a diverse group of symptoms, which can involve things like undereating or maybe overeating and losing control over eating, maybe using behaviours like exercise to influence your shape and weight. And these things cause a lot of distress to people and can really impact people's lives. So they are very important and significant mental health difficulties. And eating disorders can last a really long time. So we've been really curious about whether we can understand and spot some of the things that might be associated with eating disorders and being able to predict their presence later on, and also some of the factors that might be important in helping to protect against the development of eating disorder symptoms. And one of the things that we thought might be interesting to research was decision making. So Marta, could you help us to understand what we mean by decision making?
Of course. So first of all, thanks for inviting me to join you in this podcast, and thanks to Chloe for agreeing of being part of it too and give her her contribute. So by decision-making skills, we refer to the ability of selecting between two or more alternatives to reach the best outcome in the shortest time. So we should think that when we make a choice, we are basically defining our position in any given situation. And we should think of a decision-making process as a thought process where we weigh the pros and cons of each alternative, and we forecast the outcome of each option based on the information that we have available. So I think it's clear how this skill may have a huge influence on our personal and professional life.
Absolutely. Just in our daily lives, we have to make so many decisions, don't we? You know, from what we're going to wear that day to what we're going to have for our breakfast and who we're going to meet and how we're going to tackle different tasks that we come across. Yeah. And Chloe, I was wondering if you could give us perhaps an example of how decision making's been difficult for you as a person with experience of anorexia nervosa.
Sure. Thank you, Amy. And thank you for having me on this podcast. I feel absolutely honoured and privileged to be here. So for me, when it comes to decision making, I've never really been able to make decisions for myself. I never really developed a sense of my own preferences. That can even go down to what is my favourite colour, what is my favourite flavour of ice cream. Even now to this day, I still couldn't give you the answer to those questions. I'm very passive and let others make a decision on where to go or what to do. Because as I say, I don't really have a preference either way. However, on the other hand, I can be incredibly inflexible and controlling. I can make plans, particularly on going a trip abroad, and I'm just unable to divert from those plans or be spontaneous. So I think it's had quite a big effect on my decision making, both historically growing up in adolescence through to adulthood.
Sounds like it's played a really, really big part actually in your sort of day-to-day functioning in your life. And Marta, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more or summarize for us some of the key findings that we obtained from our research using the Millennium Cohort study data.
In our study, we explored the relationship between scores on a gambling task, which measures decision-making under condition of risk in people that aged 11 and 14 years, and eating disorder symptoms that were measured at age 14 and 17. And we found that less advantageous decision-making at ages 11 and 14 were predictive of eating disorder symptoms at ages 14 and 17. We also found that those whose decision-making skills developed less than their peers between 11 and 14 years old were more likely to have eating disorder symptoms at age 14. And we finally saw that decision-making ability at 11 and 14 years old helped to explain the relationship that exists between emotional dysregulation experienced during very early childhood, so at ages 3, 5, and 7, and eating disorder symptoms at ages 14 and 17. So what we basically found is that the cognitive and emotional skills developing throughout the childhood and adolescence are involved in the eating disorder symptoms, in the development and in the experience of eating disorder symptoms during adolescence.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add that the eating disorder symptoms that we were able to look at in the Millennium Cohort study were things like people in sort of intending to lose weight or to reduce their dietary intake, people actually doing that, acting on that intention and restricting their nutritional intake, people feeling dissatisfied about their body, and thinking that it was too large, and also people using exercise in order to influence their weight and shape. It's interesting when you use secondary data that have already been collected, and use that to address new questions in your research, because you don't always have control over some of the things that were asked. And, you know, we acknowledge that some of the symptoms of eating disorders are perhaps missing here, but I think this really gives us an interesting insight into a cognitive factor that might be involved in the later presence of eating disorders. And it very much mirrors your experiences, Chloe. You were explaining that decision making's always been quite challenging, and I think that's something that we're also seeing in our research, that there are this group of people for whom decision making is developing a bit differently and is a bit more challenging, and those are the people that are a bit more vulnerable to eating disorders. I think, Marta, you might like to ask Chloe a little bit more about her experiences.
I'd like to ask to Chloe, as someone who has experienced an eating disorder, if she thinks that it might have been useful to have any kind of support with this skill, with the decision making skill. If she thinks that, like, having had this support earlier, it might have helped her with avoiding some difficulties that she experienced going through an eating disorder.
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I've had to relearn some basic skills which weren't made available through my childhood and adolescence. I feel like I would have had a better sense of self, which I can imagine would mean that I think more of myself than just a number on a scale, or how my body is perceived by both myself and others.
Also, can I ask you, what do you think that, like, people with eating disorders need to learn to make better decision, what would you suggest? What do you think it could be useful?
I think some guidance and support from both family and school. I think school plays quite a large role in particularly younger children, on how bodies, how everyone has a different body and it's not one size fits all. But I find also from my personal experience, the consistency versus chaos. And what I mean by that is having a consistent home life and home environment versus a chaotic home environment. And it's very difficult to make good decisions when there is chaos there. So there's a numbing effect to escape from that chaos, which what feels like self-soothing behaviors like restriction, which give a perceived sense of control, but these behaviors are actually quite impulsive and are actually incredibly self-destructive. And I find that without support, routine, and a consistent home environment, it just doesn't allow for a developed set of emotional regulation techniques or resilience.
Thank you for sharing this. It's very interesting. So, Amy, would you like to discuss some of our ideas about that where we'll take the research next?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Chloe. That's very thought-provoking, because I think because the sort of eating disorders have so many different symptoms, and as you've pointed out, sometimes people can be sort of over-controlled in their behaviors, sometimes people can be more impulsive and sort of under-controlled, and there's lots of different challenges kind of involved in eating disorders and associated with them. Something like decision making might help us to explain the sort of diversity of symptoms, because when we're having to choose how to act in a given situation, we're having to make a decision, and we're trying to use information from that situation to respond in an advantageous way. And I really like your ideas about getting some coaching and some more support and some training, at school, but also support from loved ones to really develop this skill. And one of the sort of things I've learned in terms of my decision-making skills is I've observed people that seem to do it well, and I've sort of taken on board some of their strategies. And I really think that can be really helpful. I think that's how we want to take this research forwards. We'd like to develop a kind of game, actually. We're interested in the idea of gamification and serious games. And this is an approach where you produce a game that's fun and engaging and interactive, but it's not just for the sake of playing the game. It's about teaching a skill, and it's been used in lots of different ways. For example, in teaching medics how to make good decisions in a hospital setting. I think we'd like to have a go at making a game like this that could be played in an app and offering it to children. I think our research indicates that we need to offer it to children sort of in primary school, because we know that that's when things like decision making are starting to really develop. And we would hope to then follow them up and see whether those who had access to this game and played this game and used the characters to learn some new decision making skills and really enhance that ability might be more protected against the later onset of eating disorders as they grow older. And we'd obviously compare that with a group of people who just carry on as normal and sort of don't have access to this game and this app. And I think that's a really exciting application of this research, because we might be able to do something to help people to develop skills that are protective against difficulties like eating disorders, but also mental health difficulties more broadly, because there is this idea that sort of psychological disorders, depression, anxiety, and so on, may be underpinned, may be related to decision-making processes.
So let me ask you one final question. Like, how has your work or psychology research in this area made a contribution to policy or practice?
I think specifically this research really shows policymakers in the education field how important it is to spend time on supporting the development of key cognitive skills. And I think that's really corroborated by Chloe's personal experiences, because this is a skill, this is a cognitive skill, decision making, that not only helps with learning, but it could also be protective against difficulties with mental health. So I think that's the key sort of contribution that we've made. I think we've also contributed to an understanding of sort of how eating disorders develop, and we've added to the science on the cognitive factors that are involved. And I think that's really important, because sometimes people misunderstand how eating disorders develop, and they think that maybe people sort of choose to have them, or sort of it's a fad or a phase that will go away. But the reality is quite different, and eating disorders can last a long time, and are a serious mental illness. They're not a sort of lifestyle choice, as perhaps some people in sort of wider public might sometimes think, if they don't understand them very well.
I would just like to say that I completely agree, and I think it's so important that it is better widely known that in having an eating disorder is not a choice. It is, initially it can start off as a means of control, but very quickly it controls you. And I just think it's really important to know, and I really want to hone in on that what you just said, Amy. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I'm wishing you the very best in your recovery, Chloe.
Thank you.
That's it from us today. You've been listening to Psyched About Education. For further details, please see the links at the end of this podcast. Thank you.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.